Discover the power of quiet resilience. Watch how one man's journey challenges assumptions and builds a legacy of lasting change. Don't miss this inspiring story. The luxury store sat quiet and bright, with soft jazz playing in the background, and the glint of expensive items catching the light in glass cases. Shelves were lined with designer handbags, leather wallets, watches that shimmered with precision craftsmanship, and everything looked arranged in perfect order. Amidst this setting, a man entered, tall and poised with a calm expression as he moved through the displays. His attire was understated but elegant, an immaculate suit with a hint of casual style, and shoes polished just enough to reflect the lights above. He wandered, taking his time, studying items carefully as though considering something specific. From behind the counter, an employee caught sight of him and watched. Her gaze lingered, narrowing as she noted his relaxed, unhurried presence in the store. Something in her expression shifted from curiosity to subtle concern. She exchanged a quick look with the security guard by the door, who had also taken notice. The guard began to trail the man, keeping his distance but keeping him in sight, his posture tense. The man, however, remained focused on the shelves, seemingly unaware or unbothered by the attention. After a few moments, the employee reached for the store's phone, glancing over her shoulder to ensure no one else noticed. Her voice lowered, but in the empty aisles, it seemed to echo faintly, just enough for other staff members to catch snippets. "Yes, there's a man here. Well, he's acting suspicious. Yes, if someone could come and check." She spoke quickly, nervously looking around as if trying to catch the man in some small act to justify her call. The guard gave a slight nod, and she felt reassured by his presence. The man continued browsing, stopping at a display of watches. His fingers touched the edge of a display case, tracing lightly across the glass. Every move he made was careful and deliberate. When he leaned closer to examine a particular watch, a faint smile tugged at his lips, as if it reminded him of something personal. The details about him were subtle but unmistakable. His belt had a small engraved monogram, and his watch was one of a kind, a custom piece only available to those who knew exactly where to look. But none of these small details seemed to matter to the employees watching him. Suddenly, the calm atmosphere was broken by the sound of footsteps. A police officer had entered the store, his uniform stiff and his face set with a serious expression. The officer exchanged words with the employee at the counter, who gestured toward the man at the display. The officer turned his attention to the man, studying him carefully before making his way over, every step purposeful and slightly cautious. The man lifted his head at the officer's approach, his calm demeanor unchanged, as if this interaction was an expected part of his day. "Good afternoon, sir," the officer greeted, his tone polite but edged with suspicion. "Is there something I can help you with today?" The man looked at him, his expression one of quiet surprise, and replied smoothly, "No, thank you. I'm just shopping." His voice was calm, patient, without a trace of irritation or defensiveness, yet somehow his response seemed to unsettle the officer, who shifted slightly, crossing his arms as he continued to appraise the man. "Do you have any ID on you, sir?" the officer asked, his eyes narrowing slightly, his posture stiffening. The man raised an eyebrow, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, but he didn't hesitate. Reaching into his pocket slowly, he pulled out his wallet and handed over his driver's license. The officer took it, glancing at the name before looking back at the man, as if trying to reconcile something in his mind. The officer held the driver's license in his hand, his eyes scanning the name, photo, and details printed on the small card. He frowned slightly, as if searching for something out of place, some clue that would justify his suspicions. After a moment he glanced up, studying the man's face once more, almost as if looking for a flaw or inconsistency. The man stood quietly, his gaze steady, unbothered, and just a bit curious about the officer's scrutiny. Around them, a few other customers started to notice the exchange. Some glanced over, their curiosity piqued, while others exchanged quiet murmurs with each other, picking up on the tension. The store employee, who had originally called the police, stood at a distance, watching with folded arms and a barely concealed smirk of satisfaction. To her, the man's calm confidence seemed misplaced, and she appeared to be waiting for the moment when he would break, reveal something suspicious, or simply leave under the officer's watchful eye. The officer, meanwhile, returned the license without a word but continued his questioning. "Do you come here often, sir?" he asked, his tone less polite now, edged with an air of subtle challenge. "Occasionally," the man replied, slipping his ID back into his wallet. He looked at the officer, his voice still calm but his expression sharper now, as though he understood the officer's suspicion but refused to let it provoke him. "Is there something specific you're concerned about?" The question seemed to catch the officer off guard. For a brief moment he hesitated, then cleared his throat, recovering quickly. "We just want to make sure everything's in order," he replied, the implication hanging in the air. "Some people find this store a bit exclusive. It's easy to feel out of place." The man's gaze held steady, his eyes narrowing just slightly at the officer's words. "Exclusive?" he repeated, his tone cool but with a hint of amusement that surprised the officer. "I see." He turned his head slightly, looking around at the store's polished interiors, the glass cases, and the designer labels, as if seeing them through the officer's eyes. He gave a small nod, as if acknowledging some unspoken truth. Before the officer could respond, the man's phone vibrated in his pocket. He took it out and glanced at the screen. A message preview flashed briefly, and the officer caught a glimpse of it before the man clicked the screen off. "Pick something you like. Enjoy it," the message read, accompanied by a familiar name that the officer couldn't quite place but recognized as one of influence. The officer's face tightened as he watched the man pocket the phone again. The man's demeanor had shifted just slightly. His calm seemed almost unbreakable, as if he had faced far more challenging confrontations than this one. The officer felt a small flicker of doubt, a strange discomfort he couldn't shake, but he quickly brushed it aside, determined to keep control of the situation. The officer cleared his throat, shifting his weight as if to regain a sense of authority in the conversation. "Well, sir," he continued, his voice attempting a steadiness that betrayed his own discomfort. "We've had some reports lately about suspicious individuals around here. You understand, I'm sure." He gave a tight smile, but his words hung awkwardly in the air, as if he himself wasn't convinced by them. The man tilted his head slightly, considering the officer's words. "Suspicious individuals?" he echoed, his voice carrying a faint but unmistakable challenge. "In what way, exactly?" The officer's expression faltered momentarily. "Just people who don't quite fit the, usual clientele," he replied, quickly adding, "Not that there's anything wrong with that, of course." But the unease in his face betrayed him. Around them, the low murmur of curious whispers from other customers was growing, their attention now clearly fixed on this exchange. The man's lips curved into a small, controlled smile, and he nodded slowly. "I understand," he said simply, his tone as polite as ever but with a piercing edge that subtly put the officer on the defensive. "Although, I was under the impression that this store welcomed anyone who appreciated quality," he added, glancing over at the cases filled with luxury items, as if emphasizing his point. Just then, the store employee, emboldened by the officer's presence, stepped forward. She spoke up, addressing the officer but making sure her words were loud enough for those around to hear. "I called because he was lingering," she said, her voice taking on a sharper tone. "Browsing but not buying anything, just touching everything." She shot a look at the man, her eyes holding a silent accusation, as if she'd finally spoken aloud the suspicion that had been festering in her gaze since he walked in. The officer nodded as if her words validated his own doubts. "See, that's exactly why I'm here," he said, his voice firm again. "We can't take any chances. I'm sure you understand, sir." His eyes bore into the man's, searching for a reaction, perhaps even hoping for some sign of discomfort or guilt. But the man only looked at him, his expression steady, his calm unbroken. With a quiet sigh, He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet once again, and retrieved a sleek metallic business card. He held it out to the officer, who looked at it with a mix of hesitation and curiosity. The officer took the card, glancing down at it, his brow furrowing as he read the name and title printed in clean, bold letters. The name on the card struck him immediately. The officer's face shifted from skepticism to confusion, and then to a flicker of shock as he read the name. His eyes darted from the card back to the man, then back to the card, as if trying to reconcile the name with the person standing in front of him. The man remained calm, watching the officer's reaction with an air of quiet amusement. He didn't need to say anything. The card spoke for itself. The title beneath the name on the card was unmistakable. Something impressive, prestigious, a position that commanded respect and influence. It wasn't just any ordinary business card. This was a card that signified real power, the kind held by those who often moved in circles far above the everyday assumptions of people like this officer. The officer's hand trembled slightly as he held the card, his earlier confidence cracking just a bit as he glanced once more at the man, who watched him with that same calm, steady gaze. The man's expression remained unreadable, but there was a hint of satisfaction in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that the situation was finally shifting. He waited, letting the weight of the moment sink in, allowing the officer to fully process the name and title. The onlookers, now fully engaged in the scene unfolding before them, exchanged puzzled glances, clearly sensing that something unexpected had just been revealed but still not privy to the full context. The store employee, standing nearby, noticed the change in the officer's demeanor. Confusion clouded her face as she leaned forward, trying to get a better look at the card, her curiosity evident. But the officer, now visibly flustered, pulled the card closer to his chest, his body language suddenly defensive. It was clear that he didn't want the employee, or anyone else for that matter, to see what he had just learned. After a tense silence, the officer finally looked up, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and dawning regret. He cleared his throat, fumbling for words. "Sir, I didn't realize he began, his voice strained as if struggling to find the right thing to say now that the power dynamic had shifted so dramatically. The man watched him in silence, his eyes unwavering, giving nothing away. In that moment, the officer's authority felt small, insignificant compared to the weight of the man's presence. The confidence with which he'd approached had now crumbled, leaving only the uncomfortable truth of his own assumptions. Around them, the murmuring crowd grew silent, sensing the tension but still unaware of the revelation that had changed everything. The officer swallowed hard, his gaze darting around as if searching for an escape from the uncomfortable reality he now faced. He shifted his weight, the crisp authority in his stance now softened with an uneasiness he couldn't hide. I apologize, sir," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. But the man made no move to accept or dismiss the apology, simply watching him with an unreadable expression. The man let the silence linger, a silence so thick that the other shoppers and store employees seemed almost afraid to move. The officer, now visibly flustered, handed the business card back with a stiff, awkward gesture, as though touching it any longer might burn his hand. His cheeks flushed slightly, a faint red that betrayed the embarrassment he was trying to keep hidden beneath a veneer of professionalism. The man took the card back without a word, slipping it back into his wallet with the same calm he'd maintained throughout the entire exchange. He looked at the officer, his gaze steady and unyielding, making it clear that while he accepted the card back, he hadn't accepted the officer's flimsy apology. There was a subtle but undeniable power in the way he carried himself, a quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with the officer's unraveling composure. Finally, the man spoke, his voice low and measured. "You were saying something about people who don't quite fit, if I recall correctly." His words were calm, almost gentle, but laced with an unmistakable undertone of challenge that left the officer scrambling for a response. The crowd around them seemed to collectively hold its breath, hanging on every word. The officer opened his mouth, searching for an explanation, but nothing came. He cast a helpless glance toward the store employee, who had been so quick to make her accusations. She looked away, avoiding his eyes, clearly unwilling to share in the blame now that things had taken an unexpected turn. The officer looked back at the man, his confidence completely deflated, realizing that there was nothing he could say to justify his behavior. The man tilted his head slightly, studying the officer as if he were trying to read the depths of his regret. "It's interesting," he continued, his voice soft but resonant, "how quickly people make assumptions based on appearances." He let the words hang in the air, the quiet weight of them sinking deep into the officer's conscience. The officer shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the man's words. His face betrayed a mixture of shame and helplessness, his usual confidence drained. He looked as though he wanted to explain himself, to somehow justify his actions, but every attempt to form words seemed to falter under the steady, unyielding gaze of the man standing before him. The man allowed the silence to linger, his expression calm but unrelenting. He glanced briefly at the store employee, who had retreated slightly, watching with a mixture of confusion and discomfort. She clearly hadn't anticipated this turn of events, and her earlier smugness had disappeared, replaced by a look of regret as she realized her part in the unfolding situation. After a long pause, the man continued, his tone thoughtful but firm. "You see, this isn't the first time I've been mistaken for someone who doesn't belong," he said, his words deliberate and clear, each one landing heavily in the silence. "But what surprises me most is how little people are willing to question their own assumptions. They don't stop to wonder who a person really is, or why they might be here. They just see what they expect to see." The officer lowered his eyes, his face flushed with embarrassment. Around them, the other customers who had been watching from a distance looked on with a mixture of empathy and discomfort. Some exchanged glances, as though silently acknowledging the truth in the man's words. The scene had shifted entirely. What had started as an attempt to exert control had become a powerful lesson in humility, and everyone present could feel the weight of it. The man took a step closer to the officer, his gaze never wavering. "Respect is not just something you offer when someone has proven themselves," he said quietly, his voice laced with conviction. "It's something you extend from the start, because everyone deserves it. And it shouldn't take a title, a business card, or a reputation to remind people of that." His words left a profound silence in their wake, and the officer looked up, his expression now one of deep regret. It was clear that the man's message had struck a chord, reaching past any defensive walls the officer might have put up. He opened his mouth to speak, but the man held up a hand, signaling that no further apology was necessary, or perhaps that none would truly suffice. The officer nodded, understanding that silence was his only respectful response now. The man stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle, his gaze sweeping briefly over the small crowd that had gathered, each person now fully aware of the tension that had unfolded and the lesson that had been imparted. He gave a slight nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, but without a trace of satisfaction or smugness. It was simply a quiet confirmation that he had said what needed to be said, that he had planted a seed of thought in the minds of everyone who had witnessed this moment. Turning away from the officer, the man returned to the display case, his interest refocused on the watch he had been examining before the entire confrontation began. He studied it for a moment, running a thoughtful finger along the glass, then glanced back toward the store employee, who was now watching him with an expression of apology mixed with a faint apprehension. Her confidence, like the officer's, had faded, and she looked small, almost lost, in the face of the truth that had just been laid bare. Without another word, the man gestured to the watch in the case, signaling that he intended to make the purchase. The employee, momentarily frozen, quickly recovered and hurried behind the counter to retrieve the item. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted the watch out of the case, carefully presenting it to him with a respect that had been noticeably absent before. She avoided his eyes, her expression tense, as if bracing herself for a reprimand or some cutting remark. But the man only took the watch from her hands with a calm nod, his composure never faltering. He held the watch up briefly, examining it with appreciation, before glancing back at the officer one last time. "I hope," he said, his voice steady and clear, "that the next time you see someone who doesn't fit, you'll remember today and ask yourself why." His words hung in the air, final and resolute, leaving the officer looking down, his face clouded with remorse. As the man turned back to the counter, a murmur rippled through the small crowd, a mixture of whispered apologies and silent acknowledgments of the lesson they'd just witnessed. The man paid for the watch, exchanging a few quiet words with the employee, whose demeanor was now visibly softened, her previous assumptions clearly challenged and undone. She handed him the receipt with a genuine, if subdued, "Thank you, sir." The man nodded, taking his purchase and tucking it carefully into his pocket. Without another look back, he walked toward the store's exit, his steps measured and unhurried, leaving behind a silence filled with the weight of his words. The crowd parted as he moved, their expressions a mix of respect and contemplation, and as he passed, heads turned, people watched, and minds reflected on the lesson he had left in his wake. As the man neared the store's exit, a quiet settled over the room, broken only by the faint hum of the jazz music playing overhead. The officer stood motionless, still grappling with the uncomfortable truth that had been laid bare in front of him. For the first time, he truly felt the weight of his actions, the burden of assumptions he had carried into the store. He looked around, seeing the faces of the customers and the staff who had witnessed the scene, all now staring after the man with a new sense of awareness. Just before the man stepped out, a voice called after him, a soft, uncertain voice that broke the silence. It was the officer. "Sir," he began, his voice faltering slightly, barely able to meet the man's gaze. The man paused in the doorway, turning just enough to acknowledge him, his expression calm but distant, as if measuring whether to allow this last interaction. The officer took a hesitant step forward, clearing his throat. I just want to say I'm truly sorry," he managed, the words tumbling out with a sincerity that left no room for doubt. I didn't mean to disrespect you. I didn't realize who you were." The man's expression softened just slightly, though his gaze remained firm. "That's just it," he replied, his voice steady but gentle. "You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me with respect." His words were simple, yet they carried a powerful reminder that resonated deeply, not only with the officer but with everyone still gathered in the store. The officer nodded slowly, the understanding dawning in his eyes as he finally absorbed the truth he had been reluctant to see. "You're right," he whispered, more to himself than to the man, a quiet acknowledgement of the change stirring within him. His shoulders, once squared with authority, now slumped slightly with humility. The man gave him a final, understanding nod, as if acknowledging that perhaps this moment had not been in vain. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the store, leaving the officer and everyone else standing there steeped in an introspective silence. Outside, sunlight spilled across the sidewalk, casting a warm glow as the man stepped into the world beyond the store's walls, a place where his dignity, identity, and worth were his own to define. He walked with quiet confidence, his presence no longer confined by assumptions or judgments. Behind him, the officer watched through the glass, seeing him disappear into the crowd, a reminder etched in his mind to pause, to question, and, above all, to respect, not just titles and positions, but people. As the man continued down the bustling sidewalk, blending seamlessly into the crowd, the echoes of the store incident seemed to linger with him, as if tethered to the weight of a lifetime of similar experiences. He walked with purpose, each step reflecting a resilience and quiet strength, undeterred by the moment he'd left behind. Around him, people went about their routines, oblivious to the moment that had just unfolded a few steps away, a moment that, unbeknownst to them, had challenged assumptions and exposed hidden prejudices. Inside the store, the officer remained rooted to the spot, staring through the glass as if hoping to catch one last glimpse of the man. His mind raced, replaying every detail, every assumption, every moment of doubt. The reality of his actions, so casually justified minutes earlier, now settled heavily on his conscience, and he felt as though he were seeing himself from the outside, with the same judgmental gaze he had cast upon the man. It was a humbling realization, and he found himself questioning not only this interaction, but all the small, unexamined biases he had let guide him in countless other moments. The store employee, who had been the first to judge, shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, her eyes cast down as she attempted to busy herself with the register. She too felt the sting of her actions, the weight of her quick assumptions, and the powerful lesson they had imparted. For her, it wasn't just about one incident. It was a reminder of the everyday biases she rarely questioned. She glanced up, meeting the officer's eyes for a fleeting moment, both of them caught in the same shared awareness of their faults. As the initial discomfort of the crowd began to dissolve, a quiet murmur spread among the remaining customers, some discussing the unexpected encounter, others nodding solemnly. A few even approached the officer, offering soft words, perhaps of comfort or gentle rebuke, though he barely registered their presence, lost in his own thoughts. He felt a shift within himself, a nudge toward reflection, a recognition that change wouldn't come from a single apology, but from a continued effort to see beyond the surface, to extend respect as a default, not an afterthought. And then, just as the silence in the store was settling, a young child tugged on his mother's hand, looking up with innocent curiosity. "Why did that man leave?" he asked, his voice clear and curious. His mother paused, bending down to meet his eyes, and responded thoughtfully, "Sometimes people make mistakes. Today, some of us learned how to be better." Her words resonated in the air, a simple truth spoken without judgment, encapsulating the lesson that had been laid bare in the store that day. The officer took a deep breath, her words echoing in his mind. He knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but as he looked out onto the busy sidewalk, he silently committed himself to that simple, powerful idea: to see beyond appearances, to question his assumptions, and ultimately, to treat others with the respect they deserved, not because of who they were, but because it was the right thing to do. Outside, the man continued down the street, feeling a strange blend of relief and weariness settle over him. The confrontation had stirred something within him, a familiar frustration, yes, but also a renewed resolve. Moments like these had been woven into his life, small, sharp reminders that no title, wealth, or influence could fully shield him from the assumptions others made about him based solely on his appearance. Yet each encounter had also strengthened his commitment to remain composed, to confront these prejudices with dignity, to reshape the narrative instead of letting it define him. He paused briefly at the corner, watching the crosswalk as people moved around him in a steady stream. The city was alive with its usual pace, indifferent to the moments of realization and reflection left behind in the store. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if today's lesson would linger in the minds of the officer, the store clerk, and the onlookers who had witnessed it. Would they carry it forward, or would it be another forgotten experience in the rush of daily life? But he pushed the thought aside, choosing to believe that perhaps his actions had planted a seed of change that might grow quietly over time. He had spoken his truth, stood his ground, and more than anything, demonstrated that respect should be inherent, not conditional. That, he reminded himself, was enough. As he crossed the street, a young woman stopped him, her face lit with recognition. "Excuse me," she said, hesitating, her tone filled with admiration. I saw what happened back there in the store. Thank you for the way you handled it. I think you showed us all something important today." The man smiled warmly, nodding in acknowledgement. "Thank you," he replied, his voice sincere but humble. "Sometimes the quietest actions speak the loudest." The woman nodded, seeming to absorb his words, and then continued on her way. The man watched her disappear into the crowd, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. He knew that not everyone would fully understand, but each small ripple mattered. It was these moments of quiet resistance, he realized, that slowly chipped away at the walls of prejudice. And with that thought, he continued down the street, blending once more into the steady flow of the city, moving forward with a purpose that extended beyond himself. In the distance, the sunlight cast long, golden rays across the sidewalk, as if illuminating his path. A small but fitting tribute to the quiet resilience that defined his journey. As he walked further, the city's sounds and sights enveloped him, a hum of voices, the distant honk of traffic, the rhythmic clatter of footsteps all around. The world moved on, indifferent yet vibrant, each person wrapped up in their own lives, their own stories. Yet, beneath the surface, the man felt a shift, a reaffirmation of his purpose and his place within this bustling world. He thought back to the officer's face, the realization that had flickered there, the uncertainty that had replaced confidence, and the weight of the silent lesson that had been learned. He hoped, in his own quiet way, that it would leave an impression, that perhaps this officer, and the others who had watched, would pause before casting assumptions next time. For him, moments like this weren't about proving a point or demanding respect through status. They were about challenging the subtle prejudices embedded in everyday life, showing that one could command dignity through actions, not titles. As he continued, he passed a small coffee shop with a group of young people seated at a table by the window, animatedly discussing something with wide gestures and bright laughter. One of them glanced up, noticing him, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. She gave a quick, friendly nod, a silent acknowledgement. It was a simple gesture, but it reminded him that in this complex world, small moments of respect, understanding, and kindness carried an undeniable power. Turning down a quieter street lined with trees, he felt the day's tension begin to unwind. The leaves rustled gently above him, sunlight filtering through in soft patches that danced across the pavement. In these brief seconds of solitude, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the encounter drift away, replaced by a peaceful resolve. For all the moments of misunderstanding, he reminded himself, there were also moments of connection, of growth, of change. He had seen it in the young woman who had thanked him, in the mother's words to her child, and even in the officer's face as the truth dawned on him. These moments, however small, were enough to reaffirm his belief that change, though slow and often invisible, was possible. As he reached his destination, he stopped, looking back briefly as if glancing at the path he'd taken and everything it represented. He smiled to himself, feeling grounded and ready to face whatever came next, knowing he carried his own quiet power, a power that came from within and that no one could take away. And with that he turned, stepping forward into the next chapter of his day, leaving behind a lesson, a memory, and a small, indelible mark on those who had crossed his path. Entering the building ahead, a modern office tower with sleek glass doors and a pristine lobby, the man walked with a sense of calm purpose. The receptionist greeted him with a warm smile, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "Good afternoon, sir. It's nice to see you again." He returned the greeting with a nod, appreciating the sincerity in her tone. It was a small but meaningful acknowledgement of the respect he commanded here, a space where people knew who he was and understood his impact. In these walls, his identity was never questioned, his value never second-guessed. The quiet contrast between the warmth of this place and the cold skepticism he had faced in the store earlier lingered in his mind as he made his way to the elevator. Inside the elevator, he pressed the button for the top floor. As the doors closed and he ascended, he felt the familiar hum of the building surrounding him, a space he had built, a place where he could shape change from within. Here, he held a respected position that had been earned through years of dedication and hard work, but he also knew it symbolized something larger, a responsibility to be a voice for others, to challenge the very biases he'd confronted earlier. When he stepped out of the elevator and into his office, his assistant greeted him with a stack of files and a quick rundown of his schedule. Meetings, calls, proposals, all part of the rhythm of his life as a leader in the industry. But as he settled into his desk, his mind returned briefly to the events of the morning, a reminder of the world outside these walls, where his authority and reputation could be so easily dismissed by those unwilling to look beyond appearances. In a moment of quiet reflection, He picked up a pen and jotted down a quick note on a small slip of paper. It was a reminder to himself, something simple yet powerful. Change starts with one action. He placed the note in a drawer with other small reminders, each one representing moments that had shaped his journey and inspired his resolve to keep challenging the status quo. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts, and his assistant stepped in, notifying him that his first meeting was ready. He stood, straightened his jacket, and moved to the conference room, his presence carrying an undeniable authority that came not from titles or outward displays, but from the quiet confidence and integrity that defined him. Today, like every day, he would bring that integrity into his work, a silent but impactful force reminding those around him of the value of respect, empathy, and understanding. As he greeted the team gathered in the conference room, he knew that his influence extended beyond the boardroom, beyond his own accomplishments. It was woven into every interaction, every decision, and every quiet lesson he carried with him, an invisible but powerful reminder of the legacy he was creating. And as the meeting began, he was certain of one thing. The events of that morning would only deepen his resolve to continue making a difference, one step, one person, one action at a time. The meeting room filled with the familiar hum of colleagues settling in, adjusting their chairs and exchanging a few polite greetings before they focused on him, ready to begin. As he scanned the faces around the table, he noticed a few newer team members who looked eager, perhaps even a little nervous, anticipating his insights. He knew that his presence held weight here, that every word he shared carried influence and was often remembered. This awareness was something he never took for granted. He opened the meeting by welcoming everyone, his tone warm but direct, setting the collaborative and respectful tone he valued so deeply. As they delved into the agenda, discussing strategic goals, upcoming projects, and potential challenges, he listened intently, giving space for each person's ideas and perspectives. He had always believed in empowering his team, in giving each individual a voice and the confidence to express it. He saw it as a small way to counter the biases and dismissive attitudes people could face outside these walls. Partway through, one of the newer employees, a young man fresh out of graduate school, hesitated before presenting his idea. There was a brief pause as the young man looked down at his notes, perhaps second-guessing himself. But with a slight nod of encouragement, the man at the head of the table gestured for him to continue. "We'd love to hear your perspective," he said, his voice gentle but firm, encouraging without overpowering. The young man looked up, reassured, and began speaking with growing confidence, his ideas well-researched and insightful. As he presented, the senior members of the team nodded in quiet approval, recognizing the potential in their new colleague. The man at the head of the table watched this exchange with satisfaction, knowing he had created an environment where everyone felt they belonged, where respect wasn't conditional but woven into the fabric of their team. When the meeting concluded, he thanked each person individually for their contributions, a simple but deliberate gesture that reinforced his respect for them all. As the team filtered out, he remained seated, reflecting on the dynamics in the room. He understood that leadership wasn't just about driving results. It was about shaping a culture that uplifted people, a culture that stood in stark contrast to the superficial judgments he had faced that morning. After everyone had left, he gathered his notes, feeling the weight of the morning's lesson settle once more. He understood that the change he sought wasn't only for himself, it was for his team, his community, and, in a way, the world beyond these walls. Standing by the window, he looked out over the city, thinking of all the unseen faces, people who might face the same quiet dismissals he had confronted, people who deserved better. He made a mental note to reach out to his network, to engage more actively in initiatives that addressed bias, both subtle and overt. He knew that his influence could extend beyond his company, that he could help shape a broader conversation. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing he had a platform to spark change, not just within his office, but in places he had yet to reach. With a final glance at the city skyline, he turned back to his desk, his mind clear, his purpose reaffirmed. Today was just one day in his journey, but it was a reminder that the path he walked was one of quiet strength and resilience. And as he moved forward, he carried with him a resolve to continue challenging, inspiring, and leading by example, knowing that the smallest actions could ripple outward in ways he might never see, but always hoped to spark. The rest of the day unfolded with a steady rhythm, yet the morning's encounter lingered in his mind, weaving through his thoughts like an undercurrent. Between meetings, he found himself reflecting on the many layers of the experience, how a simple act of shopping had unearthed assumptions, prejudices, and a silent, powerful confrontation with deeply embedded biases. It wasn't the first time he had faced such moments, but each time it happened, it served as a pointed reminder of the work still left to be done. In a quieter moment, he picked up his phone and composed a quick email to an old friend, a fellow executive who ran a nonprofit focused on racial equality and social justice. He outlined the encounter briefly, sharing his reflections and insights, and suggested they reconnect soon to discuss potential collaborations. He knew that leveraging his own platform to support causes beyond his immediate sphere was essential to making the kind of difference he envisioned. As he hit send, a feeling of purpose settled within him. He was reminded that his influence, his voice, and his experiences could be tools to challenge perceptions, to open minds, and to forge connections with others, working toward change. He was determined to use them in a way that extended beyond his own position, that would resonate across networks and communities. Later that afternoon, his assistant knocked softly on the door, breaking his train of thought. "There's a visitor here to see you," she said, her expression uncertain. "It's the officer from this morning." Surprised, he nodded, signaling for her to let him in. A moment later, the officer stepped into the office, his posture awkward, hands folded nervously in front of him. He looked different here, out of place in his uniform against the polished professional surroundings, but his face was sincere, his expression earnest. "Thank you for seeing me," the officer began, his voice low, clearly uneasy but determined. "I wanted to come here in person, to apologize properly." The man gestured to a chair and the officer sat down, his discomfort palpable. He hesitated before speaking again, struggling to find the right words. "I realized, after you left, how wrong I was," he said, his tone earnest, eyes meeting the man's with an apology that seemed to carry the weight of genuine regret. "I've spent the day thinking about it, and I realized it wasn't just about you. It was about how I see people, and I wanted you to know that." The man listened quietly, watching as the officer spoke with a humility he hadn't expected. There was no defensiveness, no justification, just an acknowledgement of the harm done, an awareness that was slowly transforming into a desire to change. "Thank you for coming," the man replied finally, his voice calm but thoughtful. "Change doesn't happen in a moment, but it starts with reflection. I hope you'll remember this the next time you're in a situation like today's." The officer nodded, visibly moved. "I will," he said softly. "I don't want this to just be a moment I forget." As they sat in silence, a quiet understanding passed between them, a shared acknowledgement of the journey both men would continue on, each in their own way. The man knew that true change was slow, built from countless small actions and decisions, but moments like these gave him hope. And as the officer left, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that perhaps today had sown the seeds of something lasting, something real. After the officer left, the man sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the encounter. There was a subtle but undeniable satisfaction in knowing that his presence, his calm, and his words had stirred something in the officer. It was rare to see someone so openly confront their own biases, rarer still for them to go out of their way to make amends. This realization brought him a small measure of hope. He knew change was incremental, a slow tide rather than a sudden wave, but today felt like a glimpse of that tide beginning to shift. As he leaned back, contemplating the day's events, his mind returned to the story of his own journey. The journey had not been an easy one. He remembered his early days of struggle, when he had been a young man in an industry not always welcoming to people who looked like him. Those early years had tested his resolve, pushing him to prove himself again and again, each challenge an invitation to either break or become stronger. He had chosen strength, though he knew it had come with a cost. A quiet but constant pressure to be twice as prepared, twice as competent, to achieve what others might take for granted. His thoughts drifted to those first few promotions, hard-earned through relentless hours, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. He had learned, early on, that respect could not be demanded. It had to be earned through action, through consistency, through the quiet defiance of succeeding in spaces that had not been designed with him in mind. And yet, even as he climbed the ranks, proving himself over and over, he could never entirely escape moments like the one in the luxury store. Success, he realized, did not always shield him from prejudice. It only redefined the form it took. These reflections stirred something deep within him, a reminder of why he had chosen to take on a leadership role in his field. It wasn't just about personal success. It was about creating pathways for those who would come after him. He wanted to be the leader he had once needed, someone who would recognize talent over pedigree, potential over privilege, someone who would challenge the silent biases that could so easily close doors on those who deserved a chance. He saw his position not only as a testament to his own hard work, but as a platform, a tool he could wield to break down barriers, to shift perceptions, to leave the industry better than he had found it. Just then, his phone buzzed with an incoming message from an old mentor. It was brief but encouraging, a note of appreciation for the values he had carried forward, for the integrity he continued to uphold in his work. His mentor had been one of the few who believed in him early on, seeing beyond the usual stereotypes, encouraging him to strive without compromise. That support had made all the difference, and he knew it was time to pass that same encouragement to others, to make space for the next generation of leaders who would rise with confidence and the conviction that they belonged. He typed a quick reply expressing his gratitude before putting down his phone. Feeling inspired, he opened his laptop and began drafting a proposal for an internal mentorship program within his company. This program would focus on fostering diversity and inclusion, connecting young professionals from underrepresented backgrounds with mentors who could guide them, advocate for them, and help them navigate the very challenges he had once faced alone. He wanted the program to be intentional, a structured way to ensure that no one's potential would go unnoticed due to the quiet prejudices that so often lingered unchallenged in corporate spaces. As he typed, ideas flowed easily, born from his own experiences and the gaps he knew needed filling. He imagined a future where young professionals of all backgrounds would not have to fight quite so hard just to be seen, where assumptions would be replaced with curiosity, and where judgments would be rooted in character rather than appearance. His proposal outlined opportunities for career growth, pathways for leadership, and resources that would allow his company to nurture talent in a way that went beyond mere diversity metrics. This was about cultivating a culture of respect and equal opportunity, a legacy he could be proud of. By the time he finished, the sky outside his office window had turned a dusky blue, the city lights blinking to life as evening settled in. He sat back, reading over his proposal, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. This, he realized, was his answer to the day's events. Instead of reacting with frustration or resignation, he had channeled it into something productive, something that would ripple outward long after today. As he saved the document and closed his laptop, he felt a sense of purpose unlike any he had felt before. He had turned a painful moment into a vision for change, into something that could transform his company and perhaps inspire others in his industry to follow suit. And as he gathered his things, preparing to leave the office, he knew that he had taken yet another step on a path toward a future where respect and inclusion were the norm, not the exception. It was a small step, but it was powerful, a testament to the resilience that had carried him this far and to the impact he was determined to make, one action at a time. As he left his office, The quiet hum of the emptying building provided a backdrop for his thoughts. The hallways were dim, softened by the glow of evening lights, casting long shadows that reminded him of all the late nights he'd spent here over the years, working toward the position he now held. Tonight felt different, though. It felt like he was stepping into a new chapter, one where his role wasn't just about leading, but about changing the landscape for others. In the elevator, he reflected on the day's journey, from the moment he had walked into the luxury store to now, leaving his office with a renewed sense of purpose. He could still feel the residual tension of the morning's encounter, but now it had transformed into something constructive, a motivation to drive meaningful change from within. He realized that, while moments of discrimination and bias were painful, they could also be powerful catalysts for action, and today he had turned that pain into progress. The elevator doors opened to the lobby, where a few colleagues still lingered, finishing last-minute tasks before heading home. One of them, a young woman from a different department, noticed him and smiled. He recognized her as a newer employee, eager and driven, someone who reminded him of himself in those early days. She approached him, holding a stack of documents and a shy but warm smile. "Excuse me," she began, her tone polite but nervous. "I just wanted to say thank you for your leadership and, well, for the way you make us all feel valued here. It really makes a difference." Her words caught him by surprise, though he responded with a genuine smile, feeling a rush of gratitude. "Thank you," he replied sincerely. "I'm glad to hear that. Remember that your voice matters here. Don't hesitate to bring your ideas forward." She nodded, her expression brightening, clearly encouraged by his words. As she turned to leave, he watched her walk toward the exit, feeling a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his efforts were already making an impact, even in ways he hadn't anticipated. These small acknowledgments reminded him that true leadership wasn't always about grand gestures. It was often about creating a culture where people felt seen, heard, and respected. As he stepped out into the crisp night air, the city lights twinkling around him, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The city buzzed with life, cars honking, people rushing past, the usual rush of activity. But for him, tonight carried a stillness, a moment of clarity. He knew he was just one person, in one company, in one corner of the world. But he also knew that every action, every choice, every small step toward progress mattered. Walking down the street, he allowed himself a moment of reflection, feeling the weight of the day settle peacefully within him. He knew that the road ahead would have more challenges, more encounters that would test his patience and resolve. But he also knew that he was prepared, not just for himself, but for those who would come after him, the younger professionals who would walk paths he had helped clear, in spaces he had made more inclusive, more open. He turned the corner and glanced up at the skyline, the buildings illuminated against the darkening sky, each light a testament to the lives within. The city, in all its complexity, mirrored his own journey, layered, sometimes difficult, but endlessly resilient. Tonight he felt at peace with the path he had chosen, knowing he was part of something greater than himself. With a final, quiet breath, he continued down the street, his footsteps steady, leaving behind not just a day but a mark, a subtle but undeniable impact that he hoped would continue to ripple outward, shaping the world, one interaction, one decision, one act of respect at a time. As he walked, the steady rhythm of his footsteps blended with the ambient sounds of the city around him, grounding him in a sense of purpose and peace. He had spent so many years striving, working to not only secure his place in a world that had often resisted his presence, but also to create a space where others like him could feel seen and valued. Tonight, he felt that all of those efforts had culminated into something meaningful, something that extended beyond his own personal success. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced down at the screen and saw a message from his mentee, a young professional he had taken under his wing just over a year ago. The message was brief but appreciative, sharing a small triumph from her day. A project she had successfully led, one that she hadn't felt confident enough to take on a year earlier. She thanked him for his guidance and belief in her, noting how much it had changed her outlook on her career. A small smile played on his lips as he read her words, a quiet acknowledgement of the ripple effect he had always hoped to create. Her success felt like his own, a confirmation that his commitment to mentorship, to fostering talent and self-assurance in others, was bearing fruit. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had chosen to lead with empathy and encouragement, why he had chosen to break down the barriers he had faced for the benefit of others. He paused, fingers hovering over his phone's keyboard, before typing a response. "You earned this with your hard work. Keep pushing forward. I'm proud of you." It was a simple reply, but he knew it would resonate. Sometimes, he reflected, all people needed was someone to tell them they were capable, that they belonged, that their contributions mattered. Pocketing his phone, he continued his walk, his mind wandering through memories of mentors who had shaped him, and those he had mentored in turn. He thought of the cycle of encouragement, of how guidance and belief could empower generations. It was a gift he had been given once, and was now passing along, carrying forward in hopes that others would continue the legacy. He was building something larger than himself, creating a chain of resilience and strength that would stretch far beyond his own career. Turning the corner toward his apartment, he allowed himself to envision the future, one where leaders from all backgrounds could rise without fear, where young professionals wouldn't have to fight quite as hard to prove themselves, where respect and opportunity were given without question. It was an ambitious vision, he knew, but one worth working toward, one worth dedicating his life to. And as he reached his front steps, he felt a deep sense of gratitude both for the journey he had traveled and for the possibilities still ahead. Tonight, he knew that the path he walked, however difficult, was the right one. He was part of a quiet revolution, a shift in the way people treated one another, a shift in the way they valued each other. And as he unlocked his door, he made a promise to himself to continue, to keep pushing, to keep inspiring, and to keep believing in a future shaped by understanding, empathy, and respect. With that promise held firmly in his heart, he stepped inside, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring, knowing that he was part of something much bigger than himself, a legacy of change that would one day make the world a little kinder, a little more just. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight broke through his apartment window, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The clarity he had found the night before lingered, guiding him through his morning routine with a calm determination. By the time he reached his office, the city was coming to life around him, people moving with their own agendas, each journey intertwining with countless others. Today, he felt more connected to that collective journey, seeing his purpose within the larger landscape of change. As he entered the office building, his assistant met him with a warm smile and a stack of files detailing upcoming meetings and initiatives. She briefly mentioned that his proposal for the mentorship program had already garnered interest from other departments, who were eager to support and expand on the initiative. Hearing this, he felt a spark of pride. His efforts, he realized, were already beginning to ripple outward, reaching people he hadn't even anticipated. He made his way to a conference room where he'd planned a presentation for his leadership team, outlining his vision for the mentorship program and the culture he hoped to cultivate within the company. The room filled gradually with executives, department heads, and a few new managers, each bringing a blend of experience, ambition, and curiosity. As they settled into their seats, he sensed a certain expectation in the air, a readiness to engage in something meaningful. He started the presentation with a brief reflection on his own journey, sharing select moments from his early career when he had faced doubts and challenges that had almost convinced him to walk away. He didn't dwell on specifics, but his words carried the weight of experience, and the room grew still as his colleagues listened intently. He spoke of the people who had believed in him, those who had pushed him forward even when the path seemed impossible, and how those simple acts of faith had shaped his entire career. Mentorship, he said, his voice steady and clear, is about more than just career guidance. It's about opening doors for others, encouraging them to see their potential, and breaking down the barriers that limit so many talented individuals from fully stepping into their abilities. He scanned the room, meeting each person's gaze, watching as his words began to resonate. And it's about responsibility, the responsibility we all have to ensure that the next generation doesn't face the same unnecessary obstacles. He could see the impact of his words reflected in the attentive faces around the table. Some nodded thoughtfully, others jotted down notes, and a few, he noticed, looked visibly moved. For some, he knew, this conversation would be an introduction to a new way of thinking. For others, it might be the catalyst that sparked a lasting commitment to fostering an inclusive and supportive environment. As he wrapped up his presentation, he opened the floor for discussion, inviting feedback and ideas on how to implement the program effectively. A senior executive spoke first, commending his vision and expressing her support for a mentorship structure that actively sought to empower underrepresented employees. Another manager, visibly inspired, proposed pairing mentors and mentees based not only on career goals, but also on shared experiences, allowing for deeper connections and mutual understanding. The conversation blossomed, each person contributing insights that expanded and enriched the vision. It was a collaborative moment, one that reminded him of the power of collective effort, of what could be achieved when people came together with a shared purpose. Here, in this room, he saw the seeds of a culture shift taking root, a team ready to embrace the responsibility of not only driving business success, but shaping a legacy of inclusivity, empathy, and respect. When the meeting concluded, several colleagues approached him, eager to discuss specific ideas and initiatives. One of them, a junior manager he hadn't worked closely with before, expressed her gratitude for the opportunity to be part of something so meaningful. "I've always wanted to make a difference here," she said, her voice filled with enthusiasm. "Thank you for giving us the chance to do just that." He smiled, encouraged by her words and by the energy in the room. This was exactly what he had hoped for, not just compliance or agreement, but genuine enthusiasm, a willingness to engage in building something better together. As he left the conference room, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that his efforts had ignited a spark, one that would continue to grow and spread throughout the company. Returning to his office, he took a moment to reflect. Today had been about more than a single program or initiative. It had been a step toward transforming the culture, creating a foundation that would outlast him and resonate with generations of employees to come. This, he knew, was his true work, the work of changing not just policies or practices but perspectives, so that respect and opportunity became inherent to the company's identity. Sitting at his desk, he took a deep breath, letting the satisfaction of the morning settle within him. He was creating something lasting, something that would impact countless lives in ways both small and profound. And as he glanced out his office window, he felt a renewed conviction, a certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be, building a legacy that would endure. That evening, as the office emptied out and the last of his colleagues left for the night, he remained at his desk, savoring the quiet after a day filled with purpose. The city lights twinkled beyond his window, casting a soft glow over his office and illuminating the files and documents that represented countless hours of hard work and dedication. But tonight, those papers meant something different. They weren't just the day-to-day tasks of running a company. They were the foundation of a vision he was actively bringing to life, one built on empathy, equality, and opportunity for all. He stood and walked to the large window, looking out over the city, each light a symbol of someone's journey, someone's dream. He thought of the young professionals who would walk through the doors of this company, perhaps a bit uncertain, maybe wondering if they belonged, just as he once had. He hoped that they would find not only opportunity, but also allies, mentors, and champions who believed in their potential. He wanted them to feel the respect and encouragement that he had fought so hard to bring into this space. In his mind, he could already see the effects of the mentorship program he'd proposed, the growth and confidence that would come to those who needed it most. He envisioned new leaders emerging from unlikely backgrounds, people discovering their strengths in an environment that valued and nurtured them, regardless of appearance, origin, or status. He could see the barriers that had once held people back slowly dissolving, replaced by bridges of understanding and collaboration. This vision filled him with a quiet pride and a sense of responsibility, one that extended beyond his personal success and reached into the future he hoped to shape. Lost in thought, he remembered a conversation he'd had with his mother many years ago, during his early career struggles. She had told him that sometimes when the world tries to hold you back, the greatest act of resilience is to create a place where others can move forward. Her words had stuck with him all these years, guiding him in moments of doubt, and tonight, he felt them resonate more deeply than ever. He was building that place, a company, yes, but also a community, one that valued people not for what they looked like or where they came from, but for who they were and what they could become. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant peeked in, looking a little surprised to find him still there. She hesitated before stepping inside, holding a small, unassuming envelope in her hands. "This just came in for you," she said, setting it on his desk. "I thought you'd like to see it before you leave." He thanked her, and she nodded, offering a knowing smile before closing the door behind her. He picked up the envelope, its edges crisp and unmarked, and opened it with curiosity. Inside was a handwritten note from one of the junior employees, a young man he had mentored briefly, someone who had joined the company with immense potential but lacking confidence in his own abilities. The note was brief, but its words carried weight. The young man expressed his gratitude, mentioning how the man's mentorship had changed his perspective, how the encouragement he had received had helped him overcome his self-doubt and embrace his ambitions. He wrote about feeling a newfound confidence and a sense of belonging he hadn't expected to find so early in his career. The final line read, "Thank you for seeing me, for believing in me when I didn't yet believe in myself. I hope to one day inspire others the way you have inspired me." The words struck him deeply, a testament to the quiet impact he had made, an impact that stretched beyond the boardroom and into the hearts of those he had mentored. It reminded him that leadership wasn't about recognition or titles. It was about lifting others, helping them see possibilities within themselves that they hadn't yet recognized. It was about creating a legacy of compassion, one that would ripple outward long after he had moved on. He carefully placed the note back in the envelope, knowing he would keep it as a reminder of why he did this work. Tonight, he felt that his purpose was clearer than ever, a purpose rooted in something larger than business success or personal ambition. It was a purpose anchored in the idea of legacy, not just a legacy defined by achievements, but one defined by the lives he had touched, the opportunities he had created, and the change he had sparked. As he finally gathered his things and left the office, he walked through the empty halls, feeling a sense of peace and fulfillment. The building was silent, but it was a silence filled with possibility, with the quiet anticipation of what lay ahead. He knew that the journey was far from over, that there would be more challenges, more obstacles, more moments that would test his commitment. But he was ready, grounded in his vision, and strengthened by the knowledge that he was making a difference, one person at a time. Stepping out into the night, he took a deep breath of the cool air, feeling a sense of clarity and calm. He looked up at the vast sky, the stars scattered across it like distant lights, each one representing a dream, a future waiting to be realized. And as he walked down the street, blending into the city's quiet hum, he felt a deep gratitude for this path he had chosen, for the chance to lead with integrity, and for the legacy he was building, not for himself, but for everyone who would follow. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of resilience and change. If this story resonated with you, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that challenge and uplift. Let's keep the conversation going.